So the exhortation today will be given by our brother Joseph Fordham, and his title is Weighing Advice. And there is no scripture reading for this morning, so I'll hand it right over to Brother Joe.
Okay, if I steal this mic over. Not all who wander are lost. Anyway, good to see you all, and something I've been thinking about for a long time, because in all of our lives, there are tons of advisors, are there not? Lots of people who are telling you what to eat, how to exercise, where to go on vacation, where to eat, how to lead your life. And so I thought about what are the principles that we could sort of sift through all this stuff and figure out what's actually good for us and what's not, and whether it's God aligned or it's not, because everyone is a 20-minute Google expert, right? 20 minutes, they can tell you exactly what you should be doing, and they're the expert no matter what degrees you might have. And doctors, by the way, love it when you come into their practice with your Google knowledge and tell them how you should be treated. That's one of their favorites, in case you hadn't figured that one out. So there's a wealth of knowledge out there, and so what do we do to advance the slide, first of all? Let's see. Okay. I don't know if it's going to work. It's not moving at all. Is there something wrong? The power's on. Anyway, so I put together 9 different principles on what kind of things we need to look at and think about. He's got that. The rod is right here. It's supposed to be picking up. I'm gonna make it go again. Let's see if it'll work this time. Oh, goodness. Okay. All right. So we've talked about this, that today we're bombarded with different pieces of advice from social media, advertisements, friends, work, and colleagues. How can we discern between what's good and what's not? What are the principles that'll kind of help cut the thing in two? So there's advice, and then there's to advise. One is a verb and one is a noun. In advising someone, that you make a suggestion about what they should do or a recommendation of what action they should take. And it's really important for us to find out who our influencers are. Who are our advisors? Are they friends from the world? Are they family members? Thank you. What are they that are advising us? So I really liked this quote. I think it'll be helpful to you. It's from Francis Bacon. He lived in Virginia and was buried in Williamsburg. He that gives good advice builds with one hand. He that gives good counsel and example builds with both. But he that gives good admonition and a bad example builds up with one hand and tears down with the other. So we need to consider, when we're looking at our advisors, are they doing both of these things? Are both hands constructing or not? Seek advice from those who are competent through their own experience and success to give it. That's just another piece of advice. If you see someone giving you advice, make sure they are good examples of themselves. Proverbs 13:10 says, "Arrogance leads to nothing but strife, but wisdom is gained by those who take advice." And in many other places in Proverbs, it says, "A righteous king is surrounded by good advisors." And the downfall of a kingdom is when a king listens to bad advisors. In Isaiah 28:29, this also comes from the Lord of hosts. He gives wonderful advice. He gives great wisdom. And Psalms 34 says pretty much the same thing. It says, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." You know, people are gobbling down information from off of the internet and off of Google and off of Facebook and all their social media stuff. But David is inviting you, just taste and see that the Lord is good. Just a taste of it will be more fulfilling than anything you consume out there. So when you seek me and find me, when you search for me with all of your heart, from Jeremiah 29:13, very powerful verse, and it helps us to see we need to seek the Lord's advice whenever possible. So Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 23, and I think this is very powerful. It says, "However, I did give them this command: obey me, and then I will be your God, and you will be my people. You must follow every command I give to you, so that it may go well with you." So his is the permanent advice that's out on the table for us, so that they could lead good lives. Yet you didn't listen or pay attention, but followed their own advice, and according to their own stubborn, evil heart, they went backwards and not forwards. Since the day your ancestors came out of the land of Egypt until this day, I have sent all my servants, the prophets, to you time and time again, dispensing what? Good advice. However, they would not listen to me or pay attention to me, but became obstinate, and they did more evil than their ancestors. So it's really powerful saying God is your advisor, and he's been advising you all along. He's given you his law. He sent his prophets to advise you, and instead you rejected all of that and listened to the things of your own stubborn heart. Is that the world's condition right now? We're like salmon swimming upstream against the current, trying to get to the Lord. And it's not easy. It's tiring. Are you not tired? It's exhausting. When the salmon finally get to the top of the stream and spawn, they die because it's an exhausting swim. So these are the 9 that I'm going to present to you. It's just what I could come up with. If you guys have other principles, I'd love to hear them. But these are the best I could think of, and I surveyed quite a few people to just get these. So I want to start with the one in the middle. When you're given advice, what discernment do you need to have to sift through it? One is that it's God-aligned. Is the advice in alignment with God's wisdom, precepts, guidance, and laws? If the advice is in opposition to God's way, then you know to avoid it. If it's not aligned with God, then if it is aligned with God, then pray about it and move forward with confidence. So even if it's in line with the Lord, I think we should still pray about it before we make a decision. But God alignment is number 1. The term gains. So this is a general rule of thumb, but you guys can apply it how you want. If someone's interested in your long-term gains and another person's interested only in your short-term gains, how can you distinguish between one and the other? Anyone? Who's really looking out for your best interest? A long distance one, yeah. The person who's seeing the long vision for you, the long-term gains, is probably the one you can count on. The people who are saying, make this decision now, who are very short-term, I don't think they're generally looking for your best interest. But that has to be weighed based on what actually you're asking them. To help or to harm. This one I actually got from a physician, and I thought that was wonderful. I said, you were dead on right. I'm going to put this in here. Will the advice that you take help or harm others? Every decision we make, we think just affects us, and it really doesn't. It does affect a whole lot of other people. So thinking about, will it help or will it harm someone else? So think about that. The next one is the advice source. Your parents and friends taught you from a very young age, consider the source. How experienced, wise, and respectable is the advisor that's giving you their recommendations? Are they the subject matter experts in that area to be advising? In other words, if they're a chef, are they recommending a haircut? If they're a denture maker, are they advising you on what car to drive? You know, it needs to be in the field of expertise that they're supposed to be giving. When you consider the source, you can make some kind of determination about whether it is wise, foolish, simple, or naive. Advice bias is always there, okay? It's neither good nor bad. You just need to figure it out. Because God has a bias. He wants to save your life. He wants you to be redeemed. So everyone has a bias, and bias is neither good nor bad, but you kind of need to know what it is in order to figure out whether the advice is tainted or it's, gilded, one or the other. Who benefits from taking the advice? Them or you? And what do they stand to gain, and what do you stand to lose? Excellent questions to consider when someone's giving you advice. Even God's advice is biased because he's trying to save us and redeem us from corruption and the long-term detriments of sin's repercussions. Then, similar to this is advice motive. What motivation does the advisor have for their recommendation? Does your relationship help define what that motive might be? Is the motive meant to build you up or tear you down, or is it benign? If the motive is not obvious or hidden, then pray to God that it'll be revealed to you, because understanding that is very important on both levels. So the next three are credentials. We've kind of talked about this. What experiences, education, wisdom, or subject matter expert does this advisor have that's going to help you? Have they employed it in their own life? And what were the outcomes? Trust and ethics. Is this an ethical person and a trustworthy person that you can bank their advice in and move forward? And the last one is certainly not to be left out. What are your blinders? Are you just asking people that you want to hear a specific answer from? Are you kind of slimming down who the advisors in your life are because they're going to say yes to what you're asking? So we need to think about what are our blinders, probably pretty high up in the list. So they're not in any particular order, but these 9 will sort of jumpstart the situation. So here they all are together, and we're going to look at Bible scenarios and apply all 9 of them in each scenario. And you can, if there's something more you come up with, I would love to hear it because I'm sure there's more. But these were helpful to me. So we're going to start with Jethro because he's a wonderful father-in-law. Moses spent 40 years with him, so he knows him, he trusts him. Jethro is very ethical, and he comes for a visit while they're moving through the wilderness. The next day, Moses sat down to judge the people and stood around Moses from morning until evening. Then when Moses' father-in-law saw everything he was doing for them, he asked, "What is this thing that you're doing for the people? Why are you all alone sitting as judge, while all the people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses replied to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. Whenever they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I make decisions between one man and another. I teach them God's statutes and laws." So right away, what is Moses' blinder? This is the participatory class. You don't have to stay silent. He's the only one that can do it, right? It's not possible that anybody else could do his job. And so there is a blinder there, and Jethro helps him see his way through it. And so Moses' father-in-law says, "What you're doing is not good. You will certainly wear yourself out, both yourself and all these people who are with you, because the task is too heavy for you. You can't do it alone." He needs to do the big D word, delegate. He's got too many responsibilities. "Now listen to me. I will give you some advice, and God be with you. You be the one who represents the people before God and bring the cases to him. Instruct them about the statutes and the laws. Teach them the way to live and the way they must do. But you should select from the people able-bodied, God-fearing, trustworthy, and hating bribes. Place them over the people as commanders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And they should judge the people at all times. Then they can bring to you every important case, but judge every minor case themselves. In this way, you will lighten your load, and they will bear it with you. If you do this, and God so directs you, you will be made able to endure, and also with these people, be able to go home satisfied." So you can imagine the queue line for justice from Moses was from here probably back to Egypt. And he's like, set up these advisors, train these judges, and get the burden off of you. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. So Moses was able to chose able-bodied men from all of Israel and made them leaders over the people as commanders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They judged all the people at all times, and they would bring the hardest case to Moses, and they would judge every minor case themselves. Then Moses said goodbye to his father-in-law, and he journeyed back to his own land. Great story. He followed his advice to the letter of the law. Basically, Moses became the Supreme Court, the Jewish Supreme Court. There was circuit court below him, and then the junior courts below that. So it completely changed his life and the people's lives because they got justice a whole lot faster. So Jethro's advice is God-aligned. We can see that he is interested in taking the burden off of Moses. It was helpful, not harmful, to Moses, all the people, and justice itself. There were long-term gains for this and short-term gains, which is wonderful. The advisor's source was very well vested in Moses' life. He was married to his daughter. The ID hidden bias, there's no perceivable bias for Jethro's advice. He wants Moses to benefit. If we're to identify the advisor's motive was so that he would not, Jethro didn't want Moses wearing himself out. The credentials were already in place because he knew him for over 40 years. There was total trust and ethics. And Moses' only blinder was that he thought that he could be the only one to do this, right? So let's move on to another one. This is very complicated, so you're probably going to have to open your Bibles. It's not an easy one to figure all the pieces out because there's a lot of sleuthing and spying going on in the background. It's 2 Samuel chapter 15. And it's about both the advisors who came to Absalom. One is Ahithophel, who is the most trusted advisor in David's court. They said about him that his advice was like seeing God face to face and talking with him. Is there anybody in this ecclesia you think that way about? That seeing them was like seeing the face of the Lord. It's amazing the trust that was there. The other one is Hushai, who's a great friend to King David, okay? So Hushai's a great friend, and he's loyal to David no matter what. I want you to tell me what the hidden bias is for Ahithophel. Some of you might know it, some of you won't, but you can raise your, yes. He was the grandfather, of Bathsheba. So why he switches sides and suddenly leaves David and follows Absalom is kind of a story of revenge, and it all backfires. So we'll start at verse 24 of 2 Samuel 15. Zadok was also there, and the Levites with him, and carrying the ark of the covenant of God, and they set the ark of God down, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until the people had finished marching past. Then the king instructed Zadok, return the ark of God to the city. So we all know the scenario. Absalom has set himself up as king again, and David is fleeing for his life. He's going up the slopes of the Mount of Olives, barefoot with his head covered, degraded, and he's giving final instructions to everybody in his life as to what they should do. So the king instructed Zadok, return the ark of God to the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and allow me to see both it and its dwelling place. However, if I should say, I do not delight in you, then here I am. I can do nothing with me except what pleases him. The king also said to Zadok the priest, look, return to the city in peace, and your two sons that are with you, Ahimaaz and Abiathar's son Jonathan. Remember that I'll be waiting at the fords of the wilderness until the word comes from you to inform me. So Zadok and Abiathar returned the ark of God to Jerusalem and stayed there. So the two that have been set up as spies to talk to him is Ahimaaz and Jonathan. So they're going to run shuttle between what's going on with Absalom and what's going on with King David, okay? So the king also said to Zadok the priest, I already read this part, sorry. David was climbing up the slope of Mount of Olives, weeping. When he ascended, his head was covered, and he was walking barefoot. Each of the people with him covered their heads and went up weeping as they ascended. Then someone reported to David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom, Lord. So Lord David pleaded, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. So this was the critical moment because Ahithophel had been advising David his whole life. Now he had abandoned him, been completely disloyal, and moved over to Absalom instead. So he's praying the Lord will turn his advice into nothing. When David came to the summit where he used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, if you want to go away with me, you'll be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and tell Absalom, I will be your servant, my king. Previously, I was your father's servant, but now I will be your servant. Then you can counteract Ahithophel's counsel for me. Won't Zadok and Abiathar the priest be there with you? Report everything you hear from the king's palace to Zadok and Abiathar the priest. Take note, their two sons, Zadok's sons, Ahimaaz and Abiathar's son Jonathan, are there with them. Send me everything you hear through them. So Hushai, David's personal advisor, entered Jerusalem just as Absalom was entering the city. So we know how the story is going to end up. One's going to advise one way, and the other is going to advise the other direction. Hushai and Ahithophel are on two opposite ends of the spectrum. The amazing thing is that Absalom poo-poos the advice of Ahithophel and goes with Hushai. Now Absalom and all the Israelites, we're in chapter 16 now, came to Jerusalem. Ahithophel was also with them, and David's friend Hushai the Archite came to Absalom. Hushai said to Absalom, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" "Is this the loyalty to your friend?" Absalom asked Hushai, because he's very confused at this point. Why in the world is Hushai visiting him? Isn't he his father's instructor? "Not at all," Hushai answered Absalom. "I am on the side that the Lord and the people and all the men of Israel have chosen. I will stay with them." So there's a little bit of truth to that and a little bit of untruth. God did not pick Absalom, but he's making him think he did. "I will stay with him. Furthermore, will I not serve his son? As I have served in your father's presence, will I also not serve yours?" And that's exactly verbatim what David told him to say. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give me your advice. What should I do?" Ahithophel replied to Absalom, "Sleep with your father's concubines." He left and to take care of the palace. "When all Israel hears that you have become repulsive to your father, everyone with you will be encouraged." And so they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubine in the sight of all Israel. Now the advice that Ahithophel gave in those days was like someone asking about the word of God. Such was the regard both David and Absalom had for Ahithophel's advice. Do you not find this passage absolutely appalling and unreal? What did Absalom do for 2.5 years about Amnon? Begins with a P, ends with a T. He plotted for 2 years how to kill his brother because of what he did what Amnon had done to Tamar. And here he is doing it to his father's concubines on the rooftops of Israel. Now, this was prophesied by the prophet Nathan, who told them these things would happen. But it's amazing that this is Ahithophel's advice, because how is it going to encourage the people? It's bizarre that this isn't even thought through. So Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me choose 1,200 men, and I will set out in pursuit of David tonight, and I will attack him while he is weak and weary, throw him into a panic, and all the people with him will scatter. I will strike only the king, and all the people with him, will come back to you. When everyone returns except the man they're seeking, all the people will be at peace." This proposal seemed good to Absalom and all the elders of Israel. So this is the second part of advice. So firstly, Absalom takes Ahithophel's advice and does this with the concubines. The second piece of advice was what to do with David. You've set yourself up as king. He's fled. Now what are you going to do? And he's like, you should pursue him now and overtake him now. Don't wait. So then Hushai comes in to give his advice. I don't know if I have that. So this is it. Actually, I want to go back. So Ahithophel's advice is not God-aligned. It was immoral. It could harm Absalom's relationship with his father David irrevocably, and it could harm the 10 concubines. There was no long-term gains. There was only short-term failure. The source was very high. The hidden bias is that he was burning bridges permanently between Absalom, the beloved son of David, and his father. Why? Because probably what King David did to his granddaughter Bathsheba. So that's a revenge kind of thing. There's a hidden motive to destroy the dynasty permanently, for Absalom to possibly be set up as a king instead of David. The credentials couldn't have been higher. Ahithophel's advice was very strong. And the trust and ethics, he was very strong. But the Absalom's blinders were tremendous. He may have never forgiven his father for not providing justice in the case of Amnon and raping his sister. So now he had the opportunity to destroy the lives of 10 women and insult his father in every way. But he was going to follow whatever advice would get him to the top. He was very power hungry, very ambitious, and this plan would have gotten him there. So the second part of advice is where Ahithophel it all falls apart. Then Absalom said, "Summon Hushai the Archite. Also, let us hear what he has to say." So Hushai came to Absalom, and Absalom told him, "Ahithophel has offered this proposal. Should we carry out his proposal? If not, what do you say?" Hushai replied with Absalom, "The advice of Ahithophel has given, it is not good at this time." Hushai continued, "You know your father and his men. They are warriors, and they are desperate like wild bear robbed of her cubs. Your father is an experienced soldier who won't spend the night with the people. He's probably already hiding in one of the caves or some other place. If some of our troops fall first, someone is sure to say, 'There's been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.'" What is the job of any defense attorney? What are you trying to do to the jury? Plant doubt. That's it. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Plant doubt. That's all you got to do. You don't need to disprove every point. All you got to do is add a little bit of doubt to the equation, and it all kind of crumbles and falls apart. And that's what Hushai does with Ahithophel's advice. Then even the brave men with the heart of a lion will melt, because all Israel knows that your father is the valiant man and all of his men are warriors. Instead, I advise you that all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand of the sea, be gathered to you, that you personally go into battle. Then you will attack David wherever you find him, and we will descend on him with the dew on the ground. Not even one will be left of the men with him. If he retreats to some city, all Israel will bring out ropes to that city, and we'll drag its stones into the valley until there's not a pebble left. Is this hyperbole by chance, do you think? Anybody know what hyperbole is? Exaggeration. So he's exaggerating about what they're going to do. He's telling them, we're going to get all Israel behind you, and we're going to wait until we got all this together, and then we're going to attack. Since the Lord has decreed that Ahithophel's advice be undermined in order to bring about Absalom's ruin, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than Ahithophel's advice. And this is where it all becomes unraveled, and Ahithophel winds up going and hanging himself after getting his house in order, and Hushai saves the day because Absalom is defeated. So Hushai's advice is aligned with King David. Did it help or harm? It harmed Absalom and helped David very clearly. The long-term gains, we're also incorporating short-term gains, is reducing the threat of Absalom's rebellion. The advisor's source, Hushai was a strong friend of the king and well-trusted, which is why at first Absalom was suspicious of his loyalty to him. The hidden bias, Hushai's bias was to stall Absalom from attacking his father and to frustrate the plans of Ahithophel and overrule him. So the other thing that's interesting is Absalom doesn't ask one question of Hushai's advice, does he? He doesn't cross-examine. He doesn't see if there's anything behind this, a bias or anything. He just moves forward with it. The credentials, like Ahithophel, Hushai was considered a strong counsel to the king and his friends. Was he trusted and ethical? Yes, he was. He was one of the king's wise men. His ethics were high, yet Absalom would not have known that he could not be trusted. The blinders for Absalom was he was so blinded by his own glory, by his tireless ambition to be king. Any path that could get him there was his ticket for his aspirations. And so we have to think about that as, you know, the advisors we're choosing in our lives going to advise us well because it's in their interest too, or are we just being blinded by our own yes men to make decisions? So the other one that's really powerful, and I know you probably all have thought about this, is King Rehoboam. His is probably one of the most disastrous results. Because of the advisors he chose, because of who he asked, it split the kingdom of Israel for all time, okay? So Judah and Israel were divided, never came together again, and won't until Christ returns. So this piece is so powerful because of what happened with Rehoboam, and you're like, all the way through the story, I'm like, no, don't do it, don't do it. And it's just one decision after another that is so bad that leads to this. How many of you all are familiar with like the Romanovs of Russia? Anybody? Okay, so they ruled for 300 years, from Ivan the Terrible in 1517 all the way up to Alexander II of Romanov. And he was the last czar, but he made one bad decision after another bad decision. And did he have good advisors? Yes. Did he listen to them? No, not one time did he listen to them. He was advised, listen to your people, give them schools, give them hospitals, give them this. No, he slaughtered everybody who came up against him. He was told, don't get involved in a land war in Asia. Don't go up against Japan. He did. He lost the war, lost money, lost assets. During World War I, he was like, stay here in Moscow. Don't go running after your troops and try to lead them. Let the generals do their job. Fired all the generals, went out to the field. He never came home permanently after that. He was forced to abdicate. He and his entire family were assassinated. So did he have good advisors? You bet. Did he listen to any of them? No. And he lost 300 years of Romanov rule. 300 years, gone. So this is so much worse because it's Israel. So it says, then Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had done to Shechem would make him king. When Rehoboam, son of Nebat, heard about it, for he was still in Egypt when he had fled from King Absalom's presence, Jeroboam stayed in Egypt. They summoned him, and Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam. Your father made our yoke difficult. You therefore lighten your father's harsh service, that the yoke on us, and the heavy yoke that you put on us, and we will serve you. Rehoboam replied, go home for 3 days, and then return to me. So the people left. Then King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon when he was alive, asking, how would you advise me to respond to these people? So he's made 2 good decisions so far. Yay, Rehoboam. He didn't give him an answer right away. He waited. That's good. That's smart. Then he asked his father's advisors. Also, very smart. So far, we're good. And they replied, today, if you want your servant to be these people and to serve them, if you respond to them by speaking kind words to them, they will be your servants forever. Loyalty to the end of the dynasty, not just you, your son, your grandson, your great-great-grandson, they'll all be loyal if you do what we advise you. Be kind to your subjects. That's what Nicholas Romanov failed to do for the Russians. That's what so many empires that were destroyed and overthrown was because the king was not kind to his subjects. But he rejected the advice of the elders who advised him and to consult with the young men who had grown up with him and served him. And they asked him, what message do you advise that we send back to those people? And he said to them, lighten the yoke of your father put on us. Then the young men who had grown up with him told him, this is what you should say to these people who asked you. Your father made our yoke very heavy, but you make it lighter on us. This is what you should tell them. My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Although my father burdened you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with barbed whips, or scorpions in some versions. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the 3rd day, and the king had ordered, return to me on the 3rd day. Then the king answered the people harshly. He rejected the advice that the elders had given him, and they spoke to them according to the young men's advice. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke, and my father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with barbed wires. The king did not listen to the people because of this turn of events came about from the Lord to carry out his word, which he had spoken through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king had not listened to them, the people said to him, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance with the son of Jesse. Israel, return to your tents. David, look to your own house. We're done with you. Peace out, we're gone. This was earth-shattering. You think of our own Civil War and how bad it was. This was worse. It's like as if 2 states in the entire United States stayed loyal and everybody else left. That's how bad it was. So while Israel went to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites living in Judah, and Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. Adoram, you can remember his name because they didn't adore him. The king Rehoboam managed to get into the chariot and flee to Jerusalem. Israel was in rebellion against the house of David until this day. When all Israel heard that Jeroboam had come back, they summoned him to the assembly and made him king over Israel. No one followed the house of David except the house of Judah alone. Very sad turn of events. And if you think about it, it lasted forever. What happened to all the Levites, by the way, who were in Jeroboam's territory? Did they get the monthly allotment, the housing, the food, the sacrifices? What did they have to do? They had to move. They had to pick up from wherever they were and move to Judah because they weren't going to get any supplies if they did. And that's followed up in other places in Scripture, but this decision was cataclysmic for so many reasons. So was it God-aligned? King Rehoboam outright rejects the advice of his father's era, wise and experienced counsels. The young men's advice was not to align with God's ways, yet also allowed that this would divide the house of Israel that God had spoken. Was it to help or to harm? The young advisors harmed everybody. It harmed the monarchy, it harmed the people and the dynasty. And his own advisors and overseers were stoned to death. The long-term gains, there was only a short-term solution that caused more problems, and there was no forethought considering how the people might react. There was no long-term gain for King Rehoboam. The source advisor was his own peer group. They had no wisdom or experience to draw upon. And the hidden bias, what do you think these hidden bias of these young men were? Why would they say what they said? Yeah. If the king could be persuaded and follow their advice, they were a shoo-in. They would replace all these other advisors who were old in his father's generation. It's very good. The credentials, they didn't really have any. Trust and ethics, they weren't alive long enough to prove any of it. And the blinders, Rehoboam was possibly that he wanted to step out from behind his father's shadow and appeal to be more powerful and commanding right from the outset. It wasn't the humble way that Solomon had taken over the kingdom from his father. There's a lot to think about with this one. I'm not going to get into this one for the sake of time, but Job's advisors were disastrous, from his own wife to all the advice of Eliphaz and Bildad, as well as Zophar. And when I have time, another time I'll come back to that. But his three friends, none of them gave him good advice. All of them were for harm. There were no long-term or short-term gains. The advisor source, there really isn't a huge backstory for us to know. Their hidden bias was to bring him down to make themselves look good. We don't know about their credentials, their trustworthiness, but Job had no blinders where his friends were concerned. He defeated every one of their arguments, which is really amazing. Another one that's really great, we don't have time for, is Jeremiah's advice to King Hezekiah, and what he advised him over and over to do, and he just totally and utterly rejected it. And he's like, you'll save your family and Jerusalem from being burned to the ground, from all of the temple articles being stolen, and you yourself and your children killed. That's on one side. The other side is if you surrender, you can keep it all. You won't lose any of it. And still, he would rather choose his foolish advisors. That's what he says in verse 22. All the women who remain in this palace of Judah's king will be brought out of the officials of the king of Babylon, and they will say, you trusted friends misled you, and they overcame you. Your feet sank into the mire, and they deserted you. That's exactly what happens with bad advisors. They cause your downfall, you're sinking in the mire, and they're going to desert you. They're not going to stand by your side. So this is why going through people's advice and really searching by principle is so important. So he rejects it. We know that it's God-aligned. It's for his help and not his harm. There's absolute long-term gains. He is a trusted source of an advisor. The bias is to save his life. The motive is to save his life. He has got great credentials. He's trustworthy and ethical. And the blinders is that Zedekiah could never overcome his own fears. And there's also, which we won't have time to get into, Acts 27. This whole chapter is riddled with great advice that Paul gives to the captain, to the ship owner, and all the crew, all the way through. And they listen to him finally, and it really does make a huge difference in saving everybody on board. Quite an amazing story. So again, to think about it, there is long-term gains and short-term gains, whether it's God-aligned. Is it helpful or harmful, not just to you, but to those around you who will feel the effects? Consider the advisor source. Are they a subject matter expert? Are they following their own advice in their lives? And what are the results? What is their bias? What do they gain? What do you gain or what do you lose by taking the advice? What's the motive? What are their credentials? Are they trustworthy and ethical? And again, looking to see where your own blinders are and where you're not seeing to the right or to the left. So in conclusion, we live in a world full of advisors who think they know how to live your life better than you. As believers, we have to be on guard to dispel and repel the advice that is not in alignment with God, which only has short-term gains and no long-term gains. That may harm others, and being able to examine the motive and the bias, as well as to examine their trustworthiness and ethics. And we need to examine our own bias and blinders if we see our advisors are only confirming what we want to hear. Lastly, we need to take it in prayer to God and ask the ultimate advisor or counselor, God, to show us the right way. And it doesn't matter how small the decision is. It can be whether you want to buy this car or that house, or you should go to this event or not. You can find this good advice. So I thank you for your time, and